There are industrial names that sell a product, and then there are names that become part of the work itself. For generations of builders, contractors, repairmen, and demolition workers, Kango was not just a label stamped onto a metal casing. It was the sound of a wall being opened. It was the vibration in the wrist after a long day on site. It was the heavy electric hammer pulled from the van when brick, tile, stone, or concrete refused to move. A Kango was not elegant. It did not belong in a showroom. It belonged in dust, in noise, in half-lit rooms where ceilings had come down and floors were being broken apart. It was a tool made for the brutal edge of construction, where progress often began by destroying something first. And behind that name was a factory world. Kango Electric Hammers was connected to Morden and South Wimbledon, to Lombard Road, to machine shops, repair benches, test beds, depots, inspectors, lathe operators, apprentices, maintenance men, and workers who still remembered the company decades later. It was the kind of industrial story Britain produced by the thousand in the 20th century. Specialized, practical, technically capable, and deeply tied to place. But today, the Kango name no longer means what it once meant. The brand still exists. The tools and accessories still appear under modern ownership. But the old industrial structure behind the name, the British factory, the local workforce, the independent company, the sense that a tool carried the identity of the place that made it, has largely vanished. So how did a company whose name became almost another word for demolition lose the world that built it? And what does the story of Kango reveal about the disappearance of Britain's smaller industrial makers? To understand Kango, you first have to understand the world that needed it. The 20th century was an age of construction, repair, rebuilding, demolition, and infrastructure. Cities expanded, roads were cut through old neighborhoods, factories were altered, extended and modernized, houses were renovated, shops were refitted, railway arches, warehouses, hospitals, schools, council estates, and commercial buildings all needed men who could break, drill, chip, cut, and rebuild. Before modern cordless tools filled building sites, heavy-duty electric tools occupied a particular place in the trades. They offered power without the full dependence on pneumatic compressors. They could be carried into buildings. They could be used in repair work, where compressed air systems were impractical. They made the work faster, louder, and more mechanized. A demolition hammer is a simple idea only from the outside. To the worker holding it, it is a negotiation between force and control. Too weak and it wastes time. Too violent, and it becomes dangerous or unmanageable. Inside the casing, everything matters. The motor, the striker, the gearing, the insulation, the switchgear, the bearings, the cooling, the weight, the balance, the chisel fitting, the durability of parts that must survive punishment every working day. This was Kango's world. The company's story reaches back to the early 20th century, with the brand's own modern owner describing Kango as founded in 1925 and built around a heritage of more than a century in construction and demolition tools. The older trademark record tells the same basic story. Kango was associated with electric hammers and tools for electric hammers, and the mark claimed use dating back to January 1925. That matters because Kango was not born as a lifestyle brand. It came from the practical trades. It served men who judged tools not by advertising language, but by whether the machine started, whether it hit hard, whether it survived the week, and whether spare parts could be found when it failed. A Kango hammer had to be trusted in the most literal sense. A broken tool on a building site was not just an inconvenience. It could stop work, delay a job, cost wages, and expose the difference between a serious toolmaker and a company merely selling metal. This is why industrial brands like Kango became powerful. They were built through repetition, one job site at a time, one repair counter at a time, one foreman telling another that this machine could take punishment, one apprentice learning that certain names carried weight because older men had already tested them. A factory made the object, but usage made the reputation. The old Kango world was not abstract. It had an address. Records and worker memories place Kango electric hammers around the Morden factory estate, Lombard Road, South Wimbledon, London W19. It was the kind of location that made sense for a mid-century manufacturer, not the symbolic heart of British industry like Sheffield Steel or Birmingham Metalwork, but part of the dense suburban industrial belt where workshops, trading estates, depots, transport links, and skilled labor existed close together. This was not the romantic image of industry built around giant blast furnaces or shipyards. Kango belonged to a more ordinary but equally important category of British manufacturing, the specialized maker. These companies did not always dominate national headlines. They made components, tools, machines, fittings, instruments, and equipment. Their products traveled farther than their names. They lived in catalogs, tool shops, hire fleets, repair depots, and the backs of vans. They helped other industries function. Inside a place like Kango, the story would have been told through metal and routine. There would have been machine tools cutting parts to tolerance, lathes shaping components that most customers would never see, assembly benches where casings, fasteners, motors, and mechanisms became finished machines, test areas where tools were run hard enough to expose weakness, stores holding spares, repair departments dealing with the battered returns of working life, offices tracking orders, drawings, warranties, invoices, and parts. The factory would not have been silent. It would have carried the mixed sound of British workshop life: electric motors, drills, grinders, voices over benches, the ringing note of metal, the dull percussion of testing, and the background rhythm of people who knew their place in the process. A tool factory is a strange kind of organism. It does not simply assemble products. It stores knowledge. A problem found at a repair bench travels back to production. A recurring failure teaches a fitter where the design is weak. A machinist knows when a part feels wrong before the gauge confirms it. An inspector becomes familiar with patterns that do not appear in sales reports. Over time, this creates an industrial memory that lives inside the workforce. That memory is fragile because it is not fully written down. When a factory closes, moves, or is absorbed into a larger structure, the machines can be sold, the brand can be transferred, the drawings can be archived, but the informal knowledge, the way a tool sounded when it was right, the names of the people who could fix it, the habits of a department, the unrecorded solutions, often disappears. Kango's story is partly about that invisible loss. A successful industrial company is rarely just a factory. It is a system. Kango's system included manufacturing, repair, distribution, service agents, depots, and the tradespeople who used the machines. A heavy-duty tool brand does not survive on the first sale alone. It survives because workers can get parts, because repairers understand the design, because dealers trust the supply chain, because the tool hire shop knows which machines come back broken, and which machines earn their keep. This is where Kango had strength. Memories from people connected to the company describe Kango workers in roles like lathe operation, maintenance, inspection, and repair. Other recollections point beyond the main London area to places like Coventry and East Kilbride, suggesting a wider network of operations, depots, or associated facilities. The picture is not of a single isolated workshop, but of a brand supported by skilled hands in multiple places. That matters because power tools are not just consumer objects. In the professional market, they are part of an ecosystem. A contractor does not only buy a machine, he buys reliability, repairability, availability, and familiarity. The tool must fit into a working rhythm. Kango's rise depended on that rhythm. The company sold into a Britain where construction and maintenance work were constant. Post-war rebuilding, public works, industrial repair, housing, commercial refits, and later renovation all created demand for portable braking and drilling equipment. In that environment, the electric hammer became a symbol of a changing building trade. More mechanical, more mobile, faster, louder, but the same system that made Kango strong also exposed it to pressure. Specialist manufacturers need scale. They need investment. They need to modernize designs, improve production methods, manage labor costs, compete internationally, and keep up with distribution. A good product can carry a company for a long time, but it cannot protect it forever from structural change. By the late 20th century, the power tool industry was becoming more consolidated. Large multinational groups could spread research, marketing, production, and distribution across countries. Brands were no longer always tied to the factory where they began. A name could be bought, a range could be reorganized, a product line could be folded into another portfolio. For a company like Kango, this created a difficult question. Was it better to remain independent and risk being outscaled, or become part of a larger group and risk losing the old identity? Many British manufacturers faced versions of the same choice: industrial. History is often written through ownership, but factories are remembered through people. The surviving traces of Kango are not only legal records and brand pages. They are also personal memories. A father who worked there after leaving school in the early 1960s, men who remembered the maintenance department in the late 1970s and early 1980s, apprentices who recalled the factory culture, workers who connected Kango to Coventry, employees who spoke of depots, emergency orders, repair shops, and people by name. These fragments matter because they show what Kango meant beyond the product. A factory gave young people their first trade. It gave families a wage. It created routines: the journey to work, the tea break, the foreman, the shop floor argument, the overtime, the shutdown, the pension question, the pride of knowing how something was made. For some, it was simply a job. For others, it became part of identity. The trades themselves carried a particular dignity. A lathe operator did not need to explain his work in fashionable language. The proof was in the part. An inspector did not make grand speeches about quality. He passed or rejected the component. A repairman learned the anatomy of a machine through failure. An apprentice absorbed knowledge by watching older hands. This is the human side of industrial decline that statistics cannot capture. When a factory disappears, the loss is not only counted in jobs, it is counted in the breakage of transmission. Skills that once moved from older workers to younger workers stop moving. Local confidence weakens. The town or district loses a point of reference. A name that once meant our work becomes something seen on packaging, owned elsewhere, distributed through systems that no longer need the old place. Kango's workers built tools designed to break hard surfaces. But the harder thing to see is what happened when the industrial surface beneath them began to crack. Kango's decline cannot be reduced to a single villain. That would make the story easier, but less true. The company lived through a period when British manufacturing as a whole was under severe pressure. By the 1970s and early 1980s, the sector faced high inflation, global competition, changing industrial relations, currency pressures, investment challenges, and the rise of multinational production networks. Some firms were badly managed. Some were undercapitalized. Some were technically strong but too small. Some were caught in markets where scale and distribution became as important as engineering. The early 1980s were especially damaging for British manufacturing. High interest rates, a strong pound recession, and weakened competitiveness accelerated job losses. Britain had already been losing manufacturing employment during the 1970s, but the pace intensified sharply between 1979 and 1983. A company like Kango was not a steelworks or a car plant, but it did not exist outside that economy. It depended on suppliers, domestic demand, export conditions, investment finance, skilled labor, and the health of the trades it served. When the wider industrial base weakens, specialist makers feel it. There was also a transformation inside the tool industry itself. Power tools were becoming part of larger international brand families. New materials, globalized production, stronger retail channels, and later the rise of cordless platforms changed the competitive landscape. Companies that had once competed through rugged specialization now faced competitors with enormous marketing reach, broader catalogs, and manufacturing capacity across borders. Kango had a powerful name, but a powerful name is not the same as strategic security. That is one of the quiet tragedies of industrial history. A brand can remain respected long after the company behind it has become vulnerable. Workers can still make good products while ownership searches for scale. Customers can still trust a machine while the financial logic around the business changes. The decline of a factory often begins before the public sees ruins. It begins when independence becomes harder to defend. The Kango name did not simply vanish. That is what makes the story more complicated. Some industrial companies disappear completely. Their buildings are demolished. Their products vanish from catalogs. Their names survive only in old invoices, photographs, and memories. Kango followed a different path. The name survived through ownership changes. This is common in the power tool industry. A brand can outlive the factory that made it famous. Its identity can be transferred, repositioned, licensed, or folded into another corporate structure. To the customer, the name remains visible. To the former worker, something more difficult has happened. The shell of recognition remains, but the old world inside it has changed. By the early 1980s, Kango was already significant enough to be involved in wider consolidation. Sources connected to the tool repair trade record that Wolf, another well-known British power tool name, was purchased by Kango Tools Ltd. In the early 1980s. That suggests Kango was not merely a small disappearing workshop. It was, at least for a time, an actor in the consolidation of British tool-making. But consolidation can move in more than one direction. Soon the buyer becomes the bought. As larger international groups expanded, Kango itself became part of a bigger structure. Atlas Copco purchased Kango tools in the early 1990s, according to repair industry history. From there, the line between the old independent Kango and the modern global power tool world became thinner. The name could continue. The industrial roots could become less visible. This is not unusual, but it is profound, because a factory is specific. A brand is portable. A factory belongs to a road, a workforce, a town, a set of habits. A brand can move through legal ownership, catalogs, and markets. It can survive because it is useful, but survival in this form can also disguise loss. To someone buying a tool, the question is simple: does it work? To someone who worked at Lombard Road, the question is different. What happened to the people, the departments, the repair benches, the test beds, the pension scheme, the faces? Those are not the questions a modern catalogue is built to answer. Atlas Copco's acquisition of Kango placed the brand inside a much larger industrial group. On one level, this made sense. Large engineering groups could offer capital, distribution, and international reach. They could place brands within broader product strategies. They could rationalize overlapping ranges and connect tools to global markets. But acquisition also changes the meaning of a company. Before acquisition, Kango was a maker with a name rooted in its own history. After acquisition, it became part of a portfolio. That does not automatically mean neglect. Many acquired brands benefit from stronger distribution or technical development, but the center of decision-making moves. The old company's future is no longer decided only by the logic of its original factory. For workers, this kind of change can feel abstract at first. Her division becomes a line becomes a name, and a name becomes heritage. That word, heritage, is powerful, but it is also dangerous. It preserves memory and polished form. It tells customers that a brand has roots. It suggests continuity, but it can also smooth over rupture. It can make a century of work sound seamless when the actual story was full of takeovers, relocations, closures, and human uncertainty. Kango's modern identity leans heavily on heritage. That is understandable. The name has value precisely because it carries the weight of time. But for a documentary story, the deeper question is not whether the name survived. It is what had to disappear. For the name to survive in its modern form, at the next stage of the story moves from British industrial memory into global corporate structure. Tektronic Industries, the Hong Kong-based group behind brands such as Milwaukee, Ryobi, AEG, and others, acquired Milwaukee, AEG brand licensing, and Drabo in 2005. Today, Kango appears within the TTI brand world, where it is presented as a construction and demolition-focused tools and accessories brand with more than a century of heritage. This is the modern fate of many industrial names. They are no longer tied to one factory gate. They become part of international product systems, global supply chains, brand portfolios, regional markets, and professional trade catalogs. Their meaning is maintained through design language, product categories, and marketing claims rather than through one identifiable workforce in one identifiable place. There is nothing inherently false about this. A modern Kango accessory can still be useful. A brand can continue to serve tradespeople long after the original company has changed ownership. Industrial history is not pure nostalgia. Old factories could be harsh places. Old companies could be inefficient, underinvested, or badly managed. Survival sometimes requires change, but something is still lost when the connection between name, object, and place is broken. The old Kango story belonged to a Britain that made practical things in dense networks of skilled labor. It belonged to a culture where a tool was not only consumed, but repaired, known, argued about, improved, and trusted. It belonged to men and women whose names were rarely written into corporate history, but whose hands carried the company's real knowledge. The modern Kango belongs to another world, global, streamlined, competitive, brand-driven. The distance between those two worlds is the heart of the story. There is a certain poetry in the fact that Kango made tools for breaking things, because its own history now speaks to a broader breaking apart. The breaking of local manufacturing systems, the breaking of industrial continuity, the breaking of the bond between British brands and British factories. The old Kango factory was not the largest in Britain. It did not define a city the way shipyards defined places on the Clyde or car plants defined towns in the Midlands. But that is exactly why its story matters. Industrial decline is often told through giants: steel, coal, cars, shipbuilding, the great closures, the mass redundancies, the political battles. But a country's manufacturing strength is also made of smaller names: the tool makers, component makers, repair specialists, machine shops, foundries, fabricators, electrical firms, and suppliers that formed the connective tissue of industry. When those companies weaken, something larger weakens with them. Kango reminds us that deindustrialization was not only the fall of famous plants, it was also the quiet absorption of specialized makers whose names remained useful even after their original worlds disappeared. Today, someone can still buy something with the Kango name on it, but the old question remains: where is the factory behind the name? Where are the workers who knew the machines from the inside? Where is the apprentice who learned by listening? Where is the repair shop that could read the history of a tool from the damage on its casing? Where is the local pride that came from knowing that something used across building sites began on your road, in your district, among people you might know? Those things are harder to sell, and because they are harder to sell, they are easier to lose. The story of Kango is not simply a story of failure. The brand endured. The name still carries recognition. In one sense, that is a kind of victory, but it is also a warning. A brand can survive while the industrial community that built it disappears. A name can travel while the factory stays behind. A tool can keep breaking concrete long after the world that made it has been broken apart. And in that contrast, Kango becomes more than a power tool brand. It becomes a small but revealing chapter in the story of British industry itself. A story of invention, skill, pride, consolidation, survival, and silence. Because once Kango was not just something written on a tool, it was a place, it was a workforce, it was a sound. And then, slowly, the sound moved on. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more forgotten factories, lost industries, and the hidden histories behind them, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps us keep these stories alive.